Okay, so in front of me I have the second, the third, the fourth, and now the fifth generation of MacBook Pros. Apple only releases one new generation every 4 to 5 years. That's when they change the design and introduce major new technologies and features. And then in between these generations, they only update the specs. I've used every single one of the generations, and they were each a big upgrade over the previous one, with the only exception being the 4th gen, which, as you'll probably know, was full of issues. But luckily, the 5th generation not only fixes all of these issues, but also adds a ton of bonus features on top, with the first fix being the ports. You see, the 4th generation removed all ports in favor of 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports, which required users to use a lot of dongles, such as this. The 5th generation has 1 less Thunderbolt port for a total of 3, but these are actually Thunderbolt 4 ports, which means that you're getting the full 40 gigabit per second bandwidth, even if you use all of these at the same time. Previously, if you used both the left-hand side or both the right-hand side ports, the maximum speed would have been 20 gigabits per second, as each side shared 1 Thunderbolt controller. Now, in place of the missing 4 Thunderbolt ports, we do get some legacy ports back. The first one being the SD card reader. This is a UHS 2 slot, and even though I didn't see myself using this much at first, it ended up being the legacy port that I used the most for transferring photos from my camera, voiceovers from my audio recorder. It's been great. The second legacy port that came back is the HDMI port. This is only an HDMI 2.0 standard, which means that it maxes out at 4K 60. So if you want to do 4K 120, 6K, or 8K, you would still have to use one of these adapters and connect it to one of the Thunderbolt ports. But that's fine. The whole idea of this port is to connect to projectors such as this, or TVs, or anything that you want to quickly connect to without the need to get an adapter. And I gotta be honest, I've never had to use this port once. All of my monitors have USB-C ports, so I just haven't had a need for it. Speaking of not having a need for it, MagSafe is back. And I haven't really used it because you can still charge via USB Type-C, so I don't really see the point of it. It is definitely improved over MagSafe 2 that came with the 3rd generation MacBook Pros, as the cable is now braided and the connector is also smaller. But the thing is, when I'm traveling, I'll still be using USB Type-C to charge all of my devices. Really, the only advantage to MagSafe is that if you have a 16-inch MacBook Pro, it supports fast charging up to 50% in 30 minutes. The 14-inch, however, supports fast charging via USB Type-C as well, as long as you are using a 96-watt power adapter. And then the last new port, kinda, is the updated 3.5mm headphone jack, which supports high impedance headphones. Now, I gotta say, my Audio-Technica M50Xs, they do sound louder on the new MacBook Pro, but the difference isn't as big as I was expecting. So if you have some higher end headphones, you'll notice a bigger difference. Okay, the second big thing that the 5th generation fixes is the keyboard. That infamous butterfly keyboard that kept breaking and had 0 key travel was replaced with the Magic Keyboard mid-cycle, first time that happened, and that was with a 16-inch MacBook Pro back in 2019. The 5th generation uses that exact same keyboard, but with 2 small changes. The first one being the area behind the keys, which is now all black to match the keys. And I honestly think this looks great, as it clearly marks the area of the laptop where the keyboard is located. And the funny thing is that if I grab the iMac keyboard and I literally place it on top, they're exactly the same size. Apple, please make a black Magic Keyboard. Thank you. The second keyboard change being the touch bar, which has now been removed entirely and replaced with the function keys that we used to have before. These are now the same size as the rest of the keys, as opposed to the half size that we used to have before on the 3rd gen. Oh, and take a look at this gigantic escape key. This used to be so tiny on the old touch bar model. Now, the function keys are great. They're much quicker to use than the touch bar was, and I do like that they've also added a do not disturb and also a Siri/dictation button. But unfortunately, they have removed the old keyboard backlight keys and also the old launch pad, which I was actually using quite a lot. And even on the touch bar, this was much quicker and much easier to adjust. I think that what Apple should have done instead is add small displays to each of the function keys so that we can easily change what the keys are while also keeping that tactile feedback of the physical keys. Other than that, this is the best keyboard that I've ever used on a laptop. No complaints here at all. And the last thing that Apple fixed with its new generation is the performance, and this is by far the biggest one. I remember when I got my 2016 MacBook Pro, this thing was actually slower at exporting videos than my old 2013 model. It was super thin, as Intel promised Apple more power efficient 10nm chips, but Intel failed to deliver. and we ended up with some very part-hungry 14nm chips that also ran really hot, and because of that, we had thermal throttling issues and just subpar performance. With its 5th generation, Apple is using their own Apple-designed chips, the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. You can pick between the two when you configure your MacBook, but configuring the MacBook Pro this year is a bit more complicated. What you need to know is that you can pick between an 8-core and a 10-core CPU, but only the 14-inch can be configured with the 8-core option. However, even if you pick the 8-core, the performance is still incredible. In our benchmarks, we were seeing about a 27% improvement over the M1 MacBook Pro, which was already outperforming all Intel Macs in terms of the single-core performance. GPU-wise, we get 4 options: a 14-core, a 16-core, a 24-core, and a 32-core GPU, but only the 14-inch model can be configured with the 14-core GPU. From our testing, even the 14-core GPU was almost doubling performance compared to the M1. And it was also more powerful than the highest-end 16-inch MacBook Pro from 2019 with a dedicated AMD Radeon Pro 5600M GPU, a machine that used to cost $4,200. I also found out that the performance scaled quite nicely, with a 32-core GPU being almost double in performance compared to the 16-core. I also tried gaming, and I found that the 16-core performed great, with it being able to get 40 to 50 frames per second in World of Warcraft in 3.5K resolution and on ultra settings, while the 32-core got about 80 frames per second. This was about as good as an RTX 3070 gaming laptop, so super impressive results here. Of course, because these are Macs, the selection of Mac games is extremely limited, and while you can indeed run some Windows games through Crossover or Parallels, the majority of them will have issues. Do check out our detailed gaming video right here if you're curious to see how you can run some Windows games and also what performance you'll get across multiple titles. I still wouldn't consider these for gaming, but if you do plan on gaming on the side, the 32-core GPU is definitely the best option. Aside from a decent CPU bump and a gigantic GPU bump, these machines also get dedicated H.264, 265, and ProRes encoders and decoders, which massively speed up video exports. In our testing, the base 14-inch model exported one of our own videos 4.4 times faster than our own 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro, and 2.2 times faster than our maxed out 2019 iMac with 64 gigs of RAM, an 8-core i9 chip, and a dedicated Vega 48 graphics. The fact that the cheapest 5th generation MacBook Pro is more powerful than an iMac is just nuts. Now, if you get the M1 Max chip, so the 24-core or the 32-core GPU options, you get double the video encode and decode engines, which will speed up your exports by twice as much when compared to the 14 and the 16-core GPU models. When it comes to the RAM, both models come with 16 gigabytes of RAM by default, and you can bump this to 32 or even 64. I suggest most people to stay at 16 or upgrade to 32 if you plan on keeping your MacBook for another 5 years or so. Right now, I haven't found any advantages of upgrading to 64 gigs. The configuration that I got was the 14-inch with a 32-core M1 Max, 32 gigs of RAM, and 1 terabyte of storage. This is actually overkill for me as I don't edit videos anymore. I mostly got this configuration so that it can last me for like 5 years or more, and so that everything that I do on a daily basis, which is mostly scripting, researching, and occasional photoshopping, is much faster. And coming from my M1 MacBook Pro, I have actually noticed a major improvement to app launch time and overall system responsiveness. And in our performance analysis video, where we created our own benchmark tool that ran multiple real-world tests one after another, the base 14-inch was literally twice as fast as the base 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro. You can watch our in-depth performance analysis here if you want to get a super detailed look at how powerful these machines are in multiple different cases. We have temperature graphs and just loads of data. I just want to conclude this performance section by saying that if you want to get the best possible performance, even though you can configure both the 14 and the 16-inch with the exact same specs this year, which is awesome, I have found that the 16-inch can be up to 16% faster than the 14-inch when configured with the M1 Max chip. That's because the 16-inch has larger fans that can cool the system better, but do keep in mind just how powerful even the base 14-inch model is. These new chips also allow you to connect more external monitors, from 1 monitor, which is what we had on the M1 MacBook Pro, to 2 with the M1 Pro chip and 4 with the M1 Max, which is a major upgrade for me as I can finally use my 2 4K displays again. I want to show you something truly useful. This is Clean My Mac X, our sponsor for this video, and it's a tool that I've been using for the past 9 years to keep my Mac running fast. So let me quickly show you how to use it. The first thing that you see is the Smart Scan feature, where Clean My Mac X will run a number of tasks to speed up your system with the press of a button. And if you want to dive deeper, you can. For example, in the cleanup panel, I can easily clear up junk files from apps and get over 6 gigabytes back. In the protection panel, I can not only scan for malware, but I can also disable individual privacy settings for each app. The speed panel allows me to disable login items, run maintenance scripts, reindex Spotlight, repair disk permissions, and many more to speed up my system. The applications panel allows me to fully uninstall apps by removing every trace of them, even those that are not from the App Store, as well as remove app extensions. And then the files panel gives us the space lens that shows me a bird's eye view of the biggest files on my system to quickly clear up space. Check out Clean My Mac X by using the link below. Okay, so now that we covered what the 5th generation of MacBook Pros fixed, I want to talk about the extra changes that Apple made, with the biggest one being the display improvements. And more specifically, we get 5 improvements here. The first and the most obvious one being the notch. Now, I gotta be honest, I'm not a fan of the notch. Like, I get why it's there. It houses the improved 1080p camera, the LED light, and the ambient light sensor, while allowing the bezels to be super thin. But especially on the 14-inch model, it massively affects the number of menu bar icons that I can have. A lot of the apps that I use are heavily reliant on the menu bar, like iStat menus and OneSwitch. And on the 14-inch model, I honestly cannot use OneSwitch because there's not enough room for it, which is really, really bad. Like, how is this a good UI design? Come on. The only workaround that I found was to increase the display scaling, but I don't know, even then, I just felt like I needed more space. Apple should have really thought this through, like maybe give us an option for a second row for the menu bar, or I don't know, the ability to make the icon smaller without making the whole display smaller, or at least the ability to scroll the menu bar, or something like that. As right now, it is honestly a mess, but I do quite enjoy the slight extra vertical space that we get on top of the already existing 16:10 aspect ratio. The second big display improvement is mini LED. Essentially, the display backlight is split into multiple dimming zones rather than this one big backlight that we used to have, which gives us significantly better black levels, very close to OLED actually, while also giving us insanely high maximum brightness of up to 1600 nits compared to the 500 that we had before. But there are a couple of catches here. The dimming zones are still quite big, which means that you would get this glow around bright subjects when you're watching a movie in a low-light environment. However, I haven't really noticed it as much as I did on the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, so it is improved in that regard. The other catch is in terms of brightness. So while this can indeed go up to 1600 nits, that only applies to HDR content, which at least on YouTube, I never really watch unless I'm actually doing these tests. And everyday use, I will still max out at 500 nits, even when I'm in direct sunlight, which is a bit disappointing. But for me, Mini LED has actually been a major upgrade. And that's because I've actually watched a number of movies from my bed on the new 14-inch MacBook Pro, whereas with the previous model, I would only watch the movies on my living room OLED TV, as the quality of that image was significantly better than on my MacBook. But the fact that this model can almost match an OLED in terms of the picture quality is pretty insane. Oh, and when you watch a movie on Netflix or Apple TV, HDR will be used, so you will indeed get that much brighter brightness of up to 1600 nits. Of course, in my case, when I was watching at night, I had to turn the brightness down by quite a bit. The third big display improvement is the 120Hz refresh rate, which automatically goes down to as low as 24Hz based on the content that it's showing in order to save you battery life. Unfortunately, most apps are not taking advantage of it yet. Safari, for example, doesn't at all at the moment. But where I have indeed noticed 120Hz in was mostly in system animation. So things like expose, bringing the dock in, and just small animations of, I don't know, scrolling through the App Store, stuff like that. That's where I've noticed the difference. And it is very noticeable in that case. And of course, gaming, which is the biggest difference by far. The fourth display improvement is that we get the exact same reference modes and also the exact same manually selectable refresh rates like on the Apple Pro Display XDR. To be honest, I've never really used them myself, but if you need a specific color profile or a specific refresh rate for when you're editing video, then this new generation of MacBooks can do it. And finally, the fifth display upgrade is an increase in terms of the native resolution to just over 3K from 2.5K on the 14-inch model and 3.5K from 3K on the 16-inch model. Essentially what this means is that if you plan on using your MacBook Pro at the default resolution scaling, everything's gonna be much sharper. I've noticed this right away over my previous M1 MacBook Pro, but unfortunately, because of this notch menu right here, I always have to switch to a smaller scaling essentially, so that I get more icons in, which makes everything just not as sharp. So overall, it is better. Even this is sharper than the previous model, but I don't know, it's just not great because of the whole notch thing. Now, aside from the display, another bonus change is in terms of the chassis. Apple has made tweaks in the past, with every single new generation being thinner than the previous one. Apart from this last one, which is actually a step backwards. Just take a look at the new 14-inch and the old 13-inch and tell me which one looks thicker. Pretty sure that every single one of you will say that it's the 14-inch, which looks, I don't know, quite significantly thicker than the 13-inch. But in reality, the 14-inch is actually thinner. And that's because the old generation was using this sloped design. I don't know if you can see that, but it looked crazy thin. It was getting thicker towards the center. So it created this illusion that the entire device was super thin. The new generation has none of that, and as you can see, it's actually very similar to the second generation MacBook Pro in terms of the overall looks, and gotta be honest, I'm not really a fan of that. It feels very chunky, it's also quite heavy, and this is just the 14-inch model. The 16-inch model is actually thicker than the old 16 and 15, and there is also a significant difference in terms of the weight. Yeah, I wouldn't want to travel with the 16-inch as it's far too chunky and heavy. The 14-inch is much better than the 16-inch, but unfortunately, it is actually a downgrade, a major one from the old 13-inch in terms of both the looks and the portability. Like, holding both of these in my hands, the 13-inch honestly feels like a MacBook Air. We don't actually get a new color this year. We still have the same silver and the same space gray. I went with a space gray as I think the gradual transition between the gray of the chassis, the black keyboard, and then also the dark gray frame of the display looks so much nicer than this more abrupt transition that we have on the silver model, but this is just my personal choice. One thing to point out here is that if you get the space gray model, the MagSafe head won't match your device. Apple only makes this in silver, which is a bit of a bummer. Apple's attention to detail is getting worse and worse with each release. Even the manual for the 14-inch actually shows the 16-inch model in silver for whatever reason. Okay, the third change is an improved front-facing camera, 1080p this time, as well as improved microphones and speakers. So let's do a quick front-facing camera test against the 2020 M1 and the 2020 Intel model. Okay, this is a front-facing camera test and a microphone test on the new, I'm just joking, this is the 2020 Intel 13-inch MacBook Pro. And now this is a front-facing camera test and a microphone test on the M1 13-inch MacBook Pro. And now this is a front-facing camera test and a microphone test on the new 14-inch MacBook Pro. So let me know in the comments how all of these look like and sound like. And now let's do a speaker test. Let me know which one sounded the best. Okay, and the last change that Apple made is in terms of the battery. So back when I was using the 2020 Intel MacBook Pro, I was getting about 5 hours of usage at the very most. With this new 14-inch model, I'm getting between 5 and 6. So it's better, but not massively. Now, my M1 13-inch used to last me for 10 hours easily, and that's with me mostly scripting, browsing, and that kind of stuff. So coming from the M1, it's a major downgrade, unfortunately. But coming from the Intel, it's an upgrade, a small one. Of course, that faster charging does help. But do keep in mind that I'm actually using the M1 Max model here, which is more power hungry than the M1 Pro 14-inch, which would last you for longer. And then the 16-inch would last you for even longer. If you want the best possible battery life, then you should go for the M1 Pro 16-inch. Overall, I think that Apple did a great job. They listened to their fan base and they delivered a machine that is finally better than both the M1 MacBook Pro and also the 2013 15-inch MacBook Pro. The two MacBook Pros that impressed me the most. They are quite expensive, but like I said, even the baseline 14-inch will be enough for most people. I've also left links in the description with the best deals on these MacBooks in case you're considering buying one. Check out our performance analysis and our gaming test, and make sure to subscribe for more MacBook Pro content. I'm Daniel, this has been ZONEofTECH, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.